Soon after the wedding, the husband had started sleeping with his sister-in-law in front of his blind wife. On their anniversary, the wife made an announcement to everyone that wasn't about the infidelity. Jack Douglas was tired. Life had been long and full of challenges, victories, and the occasional quiet moment of reflection. But there was one thing it wasn't full of: regret. Jack believed regret was for the weak. Strong people didn't wallow in what might have been. They held their heads high, pushed forward, and refused to let anything, failure, loss, or disappointment, bring them down. Regret's a waste of time, Jack often told himself, especially when the nights were quiet and the weight of his years felt heavier. You can't change what's done. You just keep moving. His wife, however, didn't share his perspective. Helen had her regrets, many of them in fact, and more often than not, they were about marrying him. Their marriage wasn't perfect, but it worked. They had 2 children, Nancy, their firstborn, and Jessica, who came along 7 years later. Nancy was sharp, quiet, and cautious, traits she'd inherited from her mother. Jack admired her intelligence and composure, though he sometimes wished she'd inherited a little more fire from him. "You'll marry a good man one day, Nancy," he told her often, usually over breakfast as she skimmed through the morning paper. Nancy would nod absently, barely looking up. "Sure, Dad," she'd reply, not unkindly, but with an air that suggested she was humouring him. Jessica, on the other hand, was a different story entirely. Spirited and headstrong, she had a knack for getting what she wanted, often without lifting a finger. Spoiled? Maybe. But Jack couldn't help but admire her audacity even when it exasperated him. "Jessica," he'd said once, watching her from across the living room as she bargained with her mother over curfew, "you could charm the devil himself into giving you his horns." Jessica had grinned, flashing that mischievous smile of hers. "Only if I wanted them, Dad." Still, Jack worried about her. While he wanted both his daughters to find good men, he knew Jessica was less likely to listen to his advice. She was the type to carve her own path for better or worse. In the quieter moments, Jack sometimes wished for a son, not because he loved his daughters any less, but because a son could inherit the family business. That had always been the plan, or at least his father's plan. Sons were supposed to take up their father's work, continue the legacy, and face the cutthroat business world with the kind of resilience that seemed, to Jack, inherently male. If you asked his daughter Nancy, she would insist she was more than capable of running a business. From a young age, Nancy had been a serious and determined girl, excelling in school and setting clear goals for herself. Her sharp mind and practical nature made her a natural leader, and she believed her way of managing things would be an asset to the family company. But Jack couldn't trust her, not fully. It wasn't her skills that gave him pause. In fact, he admired her tenacity and intelligence. What he couldn't shake was her closeness to her mother. Helen had never trusted him completely, and in Jack's mind, those doubts had seeped into Nancy, shaping her worldview. He hated admitting it, but no matter how many times Nancy asked to be involved in the company, Jack always found a reason to say no. "I don't understand why," Nancy had confronted him one evening, her voice calm but firm. "You've said yourself that I'm capable. What's holding you back?" Jack had leaned back in his chair, folding his arms across his chest. "It's not about whether you can do it, Nancy. It's about what's best for the family." Her expression didn't waver, but her eyes narrowed slightly. "You mean it's about what's best for you?" "Careful," Jack warned, his tone low. "Don't start thinking you know what's in my head." Nancy shook her head, a hint of disappointment flickering across her face. "I just thought maybe, after everything I've done to prove myself, you'd see me differently. But I guess I was wrong." Jack watched her walk away, the weight of her words settling in his chest like a stone. He knew he'd hurt her, but he couldn't bring himself to apologize. In his mind, his decision was the right one, even if it stung. Nancy's life outside their arguments was a mystery to him. He knew she worked, but he'd never bothered to ask what she did for a living. It wasn't that he didn't care. Well, maybe it was, in a way. The only thing Nancy should be concerned about, as far as Jack was concerned, was finding a husband. A good man to marry would solve everything. With a husband in the picture, he'd told Helen once, I could bring the sons-in-law into the fold. Let them help with the company. Then maybe, just maybe, we'll get a grandson out of it. A proper heir. Helen had sighed, her fork clinking against her plate. You do realise Nancy has a life of her own, don't you? She's not going to wait around for your approval forever. Jack had waved her off. She doesn't need to wait. She just needs to listen. In truth, Jack had always pictured himself leaving his business to a son, someone who would carry the family name and legacy. But since that wasn't an option, a grandson would do just fine. It was all Jack wanted in life. To know that the business he'd built from the ground up would live on, even if it wasn't in his direct line. As much as he loved his daughters, Jack couldn't shake the belief that the world of business wasn't for them. It wasn't a matter of ability. It was tradition, plain and simple. Sons inherited businesses. Daughters married and supported their husbands. That was how it had always been. And yet, as he sat alone in his study, staring at the framed photograph of his family on the desk, Jack couldn't ignore the faint whisper of doubt in the back of his mind. He pushed the thought away. Regret wasn't something Jack Douglas allowed himself. Jack had been trying to set up both his daughters over the years, but to no avail. It never seemed to work out no matter how hard he tried. Jessica kept saying that he had terrible taste and didn't know her type at all, while Nancy brushed off all attempts for him to set her up. Nancy was a stubborn one. She wouldn't give him the time of day, never allowing him to introduce her to some of his friends and their sons. He knew many different boys who were from good families. Certainly one of them would be able to click with her. But what did it matter if there was any attraction or love? This was meant to carry on the family business. Nancy had to understand that as much as he loved her and her sister, business and their legacy were the most important. Jack learned from an early age that legacy was important. He learned it from his father and his father-in-law. How could you live life knowing that your legacy was failing? Under no circumstances would Jack be able to handle this, or accept it either. This was not something he ever imagined having to deal with in his old age. Old age had come to him suddenly. It seemed like that just yesterday he was a young man, looking forward to his future. The next second he was married, having children, and building an even more successful business than his father-in-law. Sighing, Jack started looking through the list of friends in his black book. He was going to call up a bunch of them and find out which ones had single sons who happened to be in the area. Neither of his daughters was going to be happy. Jessica was still in college, wasting her life at parties. She didn't work hard at school and only got good grades because of her last name. They didn't want to deal with him. No, Jessica was too young now that he thought about it. The best thing to do was focus on Nancy. She was a smart girl who graduated with honours and spoke multiple languages, even going on to play multiple musical instruments. This was all thanks to her late mother, Helen. Losing Helen to breast cancer had been tough for all of them, especially Nancy. Nancy and Helen were as tight as he could be while he was closer to Jessica. No matter what Helen taught her, she was going to meet whatever man he introduced her to, and she would marry him without complaint. Nancy knew her father was up to something. When they spoke that morning, he said that he wanted her to come over so they could talk. He had something important to tell her. Honestly, Nancy wasn't sure what to think of it. But the more she thought about it, the more she realised he might be trying to set her up. She tucked a strand of blonde hair behind her ear, trying to focus on work. Nancy's company was her baby. Years ago, after being shut out of her father's business, she decided it was time to take matters into her own hands. What Nancy wanted to do was create her own company that would eventually be big enough to compete with one of Jack's companies. 3 years ago, Nancy's company finally started to gain traction. It was a small company, but it was rapidly growing. Her father had no idea what was going on, completely in the dark about the successful business she had created. Nancy was beyond proud of herself, and if her mother was still alive, she would also be proud of her. When Nancy was old enough, her mother told her that the biggest mistake in her life was trusting Jack. This didn't take her by surprise because Nancy had seen how difficult marriage was between her mother and father. Helen, her mother, was the only child of George and Julia Verne. They were a wealthy family, George Verne having built his empire in trading commodities. By the time she was a certain age, he had owned multiple companies. When she started dating Jack, Helen was nervous about bringing him home. Nancy remembered her mom telling her that George didn't like Jack at first, especially because Jack Douglas was the son of a small part. However, he came around because all he wanted was for his daughter to be happy. This was all that mattered to him. Nancy had never gotten to know her grandparents because when her mother was pregnant with her, they passed away in a helicopter accident in southern Italy. This devastated Helen, who was very close to her parents. She looked forward to her parents being able to experience being grandparents, something they had always wanted. The rest of the pregnancy was difficult, causing her to deliver the baby prematurely. While this was happening, Jack went behind her back and transferred all the assets to his name. He had been spending time with George, even managing most of his businesses, so he felt like he was entitled to it. Helen had no idea any of this was happening. She was too busy taking care of Nancy, and by the time she realized it, it was too late. While growing up, Nancy remembered that her father wasn't at home very often. She didn't know the reason now, but her mother shared with her one day that when he wasn't working, he was spending his money, and not just on himself. He was spending his hard-earned money not on his wife or daughter. Rather, he was spending them on other women. Helen had been blindsided. She thought her husband was a loving, caring, and romantic individual. By the time she was able to accept this, it was too late because she was pregnant with Jessica. For the sake of her daughter, she decided to put up with it to give them the life she thought they deserved. To save Nancy and Jessica from experiencing a similar fate, Helen decided to teach her girls that they needed to be strong and independent. It was easier to teach Nancy, who was a quiet and bright girl, soaking everything up like a sponge. She and Nancy had so much fun together that Helen did her best to prepare her daughter to have a great future. Then there was Jessica. She tried to do the same for Jessica, but Jack started spoiling Jessica, leading their younger daughter to want to spend more time with her father rather than spending time with her mother. Having her youngest daughter Jessica spending time with Jack and being spoiled was not something she wanted. It was terrible. This led to Helen spending more time with Nancy, trying her best to instruct her daughter as much as she could. Even though Jessica did not have any interest in learning from Helen, she still tried to do her best to teach her. But then Jack would flash some money, and Jessica would go running back to her father. It led to Jessica thinking that everyone owed her something. Jessica had started as an entitled kid and turned into an entitled adult. It was why Nancy didn't get along with her sister very well. She thought her sister wouldn't know challenging work if it came up and smacked her in the face, which was a terrible thing to say about your sister, but it was true. Her sister was a spoiled brat, never understanding what it was like to make money. She thought it was easy to make money because whenever she needed something, their father Jack just gave it to her without even asking what she needed it for. Nancy never took money for granted. She knew that to make money, one had to work hard. While Nancy did grow up with money, it didn't mean she wasn't willing to work hard. If Helen was still here, she would be proud. One thing was for sure, she was looking down at her, proud of what she had done. Thinking of her mother did help her forget about her father. But eventually Nancy started to think about her father again, her stomach twisting into knots. Why did her father have to be like this? If only he would realize that she didn't want to get married. Nancy wanted to work on her business, focusing on building it up so it could one day compete with her father. Had he known about her business, Jack would have laughed. He would have thought that it was silly for her to focus on creating a business when all she had to do was marry a good man. Then her father Jack would take his new son-in-law under his wing to eventually take over the company. It filled her with rage but also disappointment. All Nancy wanted was for her father to look at her and say he was proud, but she had to accept the fact that this was something he would never do. When Nancy headed to the house to join her father for dinner after their awkward talk earlier that day, she wasn't sure what to expect. She walked in, and when she saw that Robert Langley, the son of one of his business partners, was sitting at the dinner table, her face fell. "Nancy," Robert called out, grinning. "It's such a surprise to see you." "Hello, Robert," Nancy ground out, forcing a smile. He was full of crap. Robert knew why he was coming here tonight, and she was the one who was being made full off. For years now, Nancy had endured being about Robert. She couldn't stand the man, but Jack liked him, so she was forced to bite her tongue. Robert was almost like the son Jack always wanted. He always knew how to charm Jack, making him feel good about himself and respected. It was no secret to Nancy, at least, that Jack wanted to marry her off to Robert. The idea of being married to this man disgusted her, but she had hoped that her years of trying to dodge the subject would make her father realize she wasn't interested. Nancy had to come to terms with the fact that her father had to know she wasn't attracted to or interested in Robert in any way. He wanted Nancy to marry him, so this was all that mattered to him. It didn't matter what she wanted because she was just his daughter. Like his daughter, she had to listen to whatever her father said. This was what Nancy's mother Helen didn't want for her. She didn't want her to end up in a terrible marriage like her mother had. Yes, her mother always made sure to say that the best thing to get out of the marriage was her and Jessica. But Nancy didn't know if she could put up with all of that just to get some amazing children out of it. Sighing, Nancy saw little choice but to put up with this awkward dinner for the next few hours. Robert kept looking at her up and down, making her feel disgusted, but Jack didn't bat an eye. He just smiled, feeling like he was doing the right thing or what he thought was the right thing. Nancy almost wished her sister Jessica was her. The two of them didn't get along, but it was still nice to know that there was someone else there with her. Jessica could act as a bit of a buffer between her and Robert. She tried her best to listen to Robert talk. He was talking about his business, which Nancy didn't care about at all. They probably assumed it was because her fragile female mind couldn't handle such information. But this was not the case. Nancy just didn't want to hear about Robert's business because she didn't give a crap about him at all. If only Nancy could say this out loud without ruining the already awkward relationship between her and her father Jack. Being here with Robert, the man her father was trying to set her up with, only made Nancy's heart ache for the one man she had truly loved, Michael. Michael came from a family of teachers, a hard-working middle-class family who found joy in helping others. It was their shared passion for education that drew Nancy to him. When Michael told her he wanted to follow in his parents' footsteps and become a teacher, she'd been overjoyed. "You're going to make a difference, Michael," she'd said, her eyes sparkling with pride. "Just like your parents." He had laughed softly, brushing a strand of hair from her face. "You make it sound like I'm about to save the world." "Maybe you are," she'd replied, her voice full of conviction. Michael was everything Nancy admired. Kind, compassionate, and steadfast in his beliefs. He didn't care about wealth or status, only about making a meaningful impact in the world. She could see a future with him, one filled with love, purpose, and a sense of shared values. But that vision had crumbled the moment her father, Jack, discovered their relationship. Jack's disapproval had been immediate and unyielding. "Michael, the teacher's son," he'd scoffed, pacing his study as Nancy sat stiffly in the chair opposite him. "Do you know his parents are in a union?" "A union, Nancy? You know how I feel about that nonsense." "Dad, Michael is a good man," Nancy protested, her voice trembling with a mix of frustration and desperation. "He works hard, just like his family, and they're good people." Jack waved a dismissive hand. "Good people don't pay the bills, Nancy. You're better than this. You deserve someone who can give you the life you're meant to have. Not him." Nancy clenched her fists, her heart pounding in her chest. You don't know him, Dad. You haven't even met him. Jack's glare was sharp and unrelenting, and I don't need to. I know enough to say this relationship is over. But Nancy wasn't ready to let go of Michael. She loved him, and she believed that, in time, her father could learn to see what she saw in him. Against her better judgment, she convinced Jack to meet Michael and his family, hoping it would bridge the divide. The dinner, however, was a disaster from the start. Michael's parents had welcomed Jack warmly, their small but cosy home filled with the smell of home-cooked food and the sound of laughter. But Jack, with his rigid posture and critical eyes, looked out of place, like a guest who didn't want to be there. So, Mr. Douglas, Michael's father began politely, passing Jack a plate of roasted chicken. Nancy tells us you've built quite the business. That must have taken a lot of work. Jack barely glanced at the man, his lips pressed into a thin line. It did, and it requires the kind of determination and vision that not everyone has. Nancy winced at the thinly veiled insult, but Michael's parents kept their composure. Well, Michael's mother said with a warm smile, hard work runs in the family. Michael's been working at the school library while he finishes his degree. Jack raised an eyebrow. The school library, huh? Does that pay enough to live on? Dad, Nancy snapped, her voice sharper than she intended. Michael's mother's smile faltered, and Michael shifted uncomfortably in his seat. We're not about the money, Mr. Douglas, he said evenly, meeting Jack's gaze. We believe in doing work that matters. Jack let out a derisive laugh. Work that matters? Tell me, Michael, how do you plan to support a wife on a teacher's salary? Because from where I'm sitting, it looks like Nancy would end up supporting you. That's enough, Michael's mother said firmly, her voice calm but commanding. Mr. Douglas, if you're going to continue insulting my family, I'll have to ask you to leave. Nancy's cheeks burned with embarrassment as she watched her father's face darken. Jack stood abruptly, muttering something about not wasting his time, and stormed out the door. Later that evening, Nancy sat beside Michael on the porch swing, her hands clasped tightly in her lap. I'm sorry, she whispered, her voice barely audible. Michael shook his head. You don't need to apologize for him. Nancy turned to him, her eyes brimming with tears. We can't let what he said get to us, Michael. It's my decision who I'm with, not his. Michael reached for her hand, squeezing it gently. I know. But your dad? He's not going to change, Nancy, and I don't want to come between you and your family. You're not? She insisted, her voice breaking. I love you, Michael. I can see us getting married one day. Isn't that worth fighting for? Michael didn't answer right away, his gaze fixed on the horizon. I want that too, he said finally. But I don't know if your father will ever let that happen. That night marked the beginning of the end for them. No matter how much they tried to ignore Jack's disapproval, his shadow loomed large over their relationship, slowly chipping away at the foundation they had built. Nancy tried to make things work, but Michael refused to allow Nancy's father to treat her or anyone else that way. So, after a huge fight, they broke up. It had been over 2 years since the breakup. She still mourned that relationship, wishing that she could be back with him. Being with Michael was the only time she felt happy and like she could be herself. By the time Nancy was able to get out of her thoughts, she realized that both her father and Robert were looking at her. She blinked. Yes? Pay better attention, Nancy, Jack said with a sigh. Anyway, I was talking to Robert about a probable future between the two of you. What do you think? Nancy looked between Robert and her father Jack. She felt like she was in a tricky situation. Did no one care that she didn't want to do this? Robert wasn't someone she was interested in, but her father didn't care. Hell, Robert didn't even seem to care. He only cared about marrying her to up his status. Marrying the Douglas family would give him a lot of respect in their society. I suppose. The moment those words escaped her, Nancy knew it was over for her. She had just sealed her fate, and that fate was going to be tied to Robert Langley. Nancy married Robert Langley in a grand ceremony that could only be described as excessive. The guest list stretched into the hundreds, a sea of unfamiliar faces mingling with a handful of friends she actually cared about. Her father had spared no expense, pouring hundreds of thousands of dollars into the event. The centerpiece of it all was her wedding dress, a glittering, ornate creation that cost a staggering $100,000. So as Nancy stood in front of the mirror that morning staring at her reflection, she felt like an imposter in her own life. The dress was heavy, suffocating in its extravagance. It wasn't her. She wanted to rip it off and change into something simple, something that didn't make her feel like a doll on display. The ceremony itself felt like a blur. She barely registered the words being spoken, her mind wandering as she exchanged vows with a man she didn't love. Robert was kind, yes, but awkward. Weird in ways that made her feel like they would never truly connect. When he smiled at her during the ceremony, it felt forced, as though he was as out of place in this spectacle as she was. "This is for Dad," she reminded herself, stealing a glance at her father who looked proud and smug, soaking in the admiration of his peers. "It's all for him. This wedding is his dream, not mine." Nancy tried to focus on the positives, or at least what could be considered positives. Robert wasn't a bad man. He was polite, steady, and came from the kind of family her father respected. Maybe, just maybe, she could learn to care for him in time. Love might be out of reach, but perhaps they could find mutual respect, or at the very least, companionship. During the reception, Robert approached her with 2 glasses of champagne. "You okay?" he asked, his voice soft but uncertain, as though he wasn't sure how to talk to her. Nancy forced a smile, taking one of the glasses. "I'm fine," she lied. "You seem uncomfortable," he pressed gently. Nancy hesitated, swirling the champagne in her glass. "It's just a lot," she admitted. "All of this. The people, the lights, the dress." She gestured vaguely at the elaborate lace and beadwork. "I feel like I'm wearing a chandelier." Robert chuckled awkwardly, looking down at his shoes. "Yeah, I guess it's a bit much. Your dad really went all out, huh?" She nodded, her smile fading. He did. For him, this is the perfect day. "And for you?" he asked, his voice quieter now. Nancy glanced at him, taken aback by the question. She searched his face for a moment, looking for any sign of malice or sarcasm, but found none. He genuinely wanted to know. "I don't know," she said honestly. "I guess I'm still figuring that out." He nodded, as though he understood, but said nothing more. As the night wore on and the festivities continued, Nancy found herself clinging to a single hope, that Robert might surprise her, that he might turn out to be a better man than she expected. Maybe he could even be a great father, someone who would give their future children the kind of stability she'd always craved. If she could hold on to that hope, perhaps this new chapter wouldn't be as difficult to endure. Maybe, just maybe, she could find a way to make it work. But as she watched her father bask in the glory of the night, surrounded by guests praising the grandeur of the event, Nancy couldn't shake the feeling that this wasn't her life anymore. It was his. After the wedding, Nancy and Robert embarked on what could only be described as an excruciatingly awkward honeymoon. The destination, an over-the-top luxury resort in the Caribbean, had been chosen by her father, not them. It was beautiful, of course, but Nancy couldn't shake the feeling that the trip was more about appearances than any genuine celebration of their new life together. Their conversations during the trip were stilted, filled with polite pleasantries that only highlighted the chasm between them. Robert, for his part, seemed eager to please, but Nancy found his attempts to spark meaningful dialogue clumsy and forced. One evening, as they sat on the terrace of their private villa, overlooking the ocean, Robert turned to her with a nervous smile. "This place is amazing, isn't it?" Nancy took a sip of her wine, nodding absently. "It's nice," she said, her tone lacking enthusiasm. Robert hesitated before speaking again. I know this whole thing hasn't exactly been..." He trailed off, searching for the right word. Romantic, Nancy offered, her voice tinged with sarcasm. He chuckled awkwardly. Yeah, romantic. She sighed, setting her glass down on the table. Look, Robert, I know neither of us chose this, but maybe we can figure out a way to make it work. Yeah, he said, nodding. I'd like that. But despite his words, Nancy couldn't shake the feeling that they were just two strangers playing roles in a script neither of them had written. When they returned, they moved into an expensive house her father had bought for them, just a few streets away from his own. The house was grand, with pristine marble floors and an enormous chandelier in the foyer. It felt cold to Nancy, like a museum rather than a home. Robert's presence at her father's business began almost immediately. Jack wasted no time in moulding his new son-in-law into the heir he'd always wanted. Nancy, meanwhile, quietly returned to her own work, her secret business that no one, not even Robert, knew about. Nancy's business was her lifeline, the one thing in her life that felt truly hers. She had started it years ago, building it in secret to avoid her father's disapproval. Jack had always believed women had no place in the business world unless it was to support their husbands. Nancy had heard his lectures enough times to know that if he found out about her company, he'd demand she shut it down immediately. But she couldn't. Her business wasn't just a source of income, it was a reflection of her independence, her ability to succeed on her own terms. She poured her heart into it, working late into the night from the small home office she'd claimed under the guise of redecorating. One evening, as Robert returned home from another long day at her father's company, he found Nancy in the office. "Burning the midnight oil?" he asked, peeking in. Nancy quickly minimized her laptop screen, smiling tightly. "Just catching up on some things." "Work things?" he asked, tilting his head. "Just personal projects," she replied smoothly, standing up and walking over to him. "How was your day?" He shrugged. "Busy. Your dad had me shadowing his VP today. Lots to learn." "That sounds interesting," she said, trying to sound supportive, though the truth was she didn't care much for the details of her father's business. Robert lingered for a moment, as if he wanted to ask more, but eventually he nodded. "Well, don't stay up too late. Good night, Nancy." "Good night, Robert," she replied, watching him leave before returning to her work. As the weeks turned into months, Nancy maintained her double life. By day, she played the dutiful wife, attending dinners and functions with Robert, and keeping up appearances for her father. By night, she was the entrepreneur, chasing her own dreams in secret. Robert was an absentee husband. He was often working, wanting to make her father proud. If anything, he seemed more intent on spending time with her father than her. Then there was Jessica, who started visiting more. With their houses being so close, it made sense that Jessica might want to stop by, but she and Nancy had never been close. It caused her to raise an eyebrow. For a moment, Nancy did hope that perhaps she and her sister could have that close sisterly bond. This was something Nancy already wanted. Then, something devastating hit Nancy. Jessica didn't seem interested in spending time with her anymore. Her sister seemed far more interested in Robert's company than her own. It wasn't just a passing observation, it was obvious. Jessica would light up when Robert was around, laughing at his awkward jokes and hanging on his every word. At family dinners, she'd sit beside him, engrossed in conversation, while Nancy found herself pushed to the periphery, watching as her husband and sister forged a connection she couldn't quite understand. At first, Nancy tried to rationalize it. "They're just being friendly," she told herself. "Jessica's always been sociable. She probably just feels sorry for Robert." But the more she saw them together, the harder it became to ignore the sinking feeling in her chest. It wasn't just friendliness. It was something deeper. Jessica seemed to genuinely enjoy Robert's company in a way she never seemed to enjoy Nancy's anymore. One evening, after another awkward dinner where Jessica and Robert chatted animatedly while Nancy sat silently, she finally confronted her sister. "Jessica, can I talk to you for a second?" Nancy asked, pulling her aside into the hallway. "Sure," Jessica said, looking a little surprised. Nancy hesitated, unsure how to phrase what she was feeling without sounding accusatory. "I've noticed. You've been spending a lot of time with Robert lately." Jessica raised an eyebrow. "Is that a problem?" "I don't know," Nancy admitted, crossing her arms. Jessica frowned, her expression turning defensive. "Robert's easy to talk to. He's different. He actually listens." Nancy flinched at the words, but tried to keep her composure. "And I don't listen." Jessica sighed, rubbing her temples. "That's not what I meant. It's just, you're always busy. You have your business, your routines. I guess I figured you didn't have time for stuff like this." Nancy stared at her sister, stunned. The words stung more than she cared to admit. "Stuff like what, spending time with you?" Jessica shrugged, avoiding her gaze. "I don't know, Nancy. You've seemed distant for a while now. Maybe I've just moved on." By this point, though, Nancy found herself no longer caring as much. The initial hurt began to dull, replaced by a steely resolve. Nancy had more important things to focus on, her business, the one thing in her life that still felt like it was entirely hers. She threw herself into her work with renewed determination, spending long hours in her office, sketching plans, making calls, and running the numbers. Her business was thriving, and every small success reminded her that she didn't need anyone's approval, not her father's, not Robert's, not even Jessica's. It was also something Nancy still had to keep secret because if her husband or father found out about it, they would demand she close it. God forbid Nancy tries to have a business. She had a plan for when or if she had children. Her best friend Lily would take over the reins, allowing Nancy to step back and raise their children. Nancy wasn't sure when they were going to have children. Her husband was not paying much attention to her, either working or elsewhere in the house if he was home. It made her think about her mother and everything she had to deal with while being married to Jack. Perhaps this was what her mother was trying to prevent. Nancy wished she hadn't given in and married Robert, but it was too late. She had made her bed, and now she had to lie in it. The only person Nancy felt she could truly confide in from either household was Benjamin. He had been with the family for decades, starting as a housekeeper when her grandfather was alive. Back then, Benjamin had been just a teenager, but his quiet dedication and unyielding loyalty saw him rise to the position of butler, a role he carried with grace ever since. One afternoon, when Nancy stopped by her father's house for an unannounced visit, she was disappointed, though unsurprised, to learn that he wasn't home. He had failed to tell her as usual. Frustrated, she wandered through the house, her heels clicking softly against the marble floors, until she bumped into Benjamin in the hallway near the library. "Miss Nancy," Benjamin greeted her warmly, bowing his head slightly. His voice, as always, carried a calm, steady tone that soothed her. "Benjamin!" she exclaimed, genuinely pleased to see him. "How have you been?" "I've been fine, miss," he replied with a polite smile, but there was something in his eyes, a flicker of sadness, of hesitation that caught her attention. "Are you sure?" she pressed gently. "You look troubled." Benjamin paused, glancing down the hall as though to ensure they were alone. Finally he sighed. "To be honest, Miss Nancy, I've been thinking of leaving." Nancy froze, her breath catching. "What do you mean you're leaving?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. He looked at her with the kind of tenderness that came from years of watching her grow up, his expression both kind and weary. "I think it's time for me to retire from this family," he said softly. "Now that you are no longer in this household, there's no reason for me to stay." "Benjamin, that doesn't make any sense," she said, shaking her head. "You've been here forever. You're part of this family's history." He hesitated, then spoke quietly. "You're the only one who has ever cared about this family's well-being, its heritage, since your mother's death. Everyone else is sick inside." Nancy frowned, a knot forming in her stomach. "Sick inside? Ben, I don't understand." Benjamin sighed heavily as though he carried the weight of the family's secrets on his shoulders. "Please," he said, his voice almost pleading, "forget what I said. Let's pretend we never had this conversation. Benjamin, she started, but he shook his head firmly. I must get back to my duties, Miss Nancy, he said, his tone returning to its usual calm professionalism. It was lovely to see you. Please take care of yourself. With that, he bowed slightly and walked away, leaving Nancy standing alone in the hallway, her mind spinning. No matter how hard she tried to get him to open up further in the following days, Benjamin refused to revisit the subject. But his words stayed with her, echoing in her mind long after their conversation ended. He was right. This family was sick inside. No one seemed to care about anyone but themselves anymore. Her father was consumed by reputation, always more concerned with appearances than genuine connection. Robert, too, had fallen into her father's orbit, his ambitions shaped entirely by what Jack wanted him to be. And Jessica, her own sister, seemed lost in her pursuit of validation from the very people who would discard her the moment she became inconvenient. Nancy felt the weight of it all pressing down on her. When her mother was alive, she had someone to share these concerns with, someone who saw the cracks beneath the polished exterior of their family. But her mother was gone, and with her, the last thread of warmth that had held the family together. Even her best friend was too far removed to understand the depths of what Nancy was feeling. Or Michael. Thinking of Michael was something she had been doing a lot lately. He had been such a good man, someone she would always love. She wished that he were by her side and the two of them were married. Robert was never someone she was going to fall in love with. It simply wasn't going to happen. And Nancy had tried to force herself to fall in love with him even before they were married, but the feelings weren't there. The same went for the attraction. She was just stuck in this loveless marriage, hoping that she would have children soon. At least children would help fill the void. Throughout all this, Ben's words were on her mind. She wondered if there was anything she could do with those words instead of reflecting on them. There had to be something she could do, but Nancy wasn't able to figure out what to do because everything changed one night. The day had been uneventful, even mundane, as Nancy went about her usual routine. She was always busy, juggling errands and work, moving from one task to the next with practiced efficiency. It was, by all accounts, an ordinary day. But as Nancy headed home that evening, the ordinary shattered in an instant. The sun had dipped low on the horizon, painting the sky in soft hues of pink and orange. She was driving along the familiar route to her house, humming along to the music on the radio. The roads were busier than usual, the rush-hour traffic adding a layer of tension to her otherwise calm demeanour. She barely noticed the car speeding toward the intersection until it was too late. A flash of headlights, the screech of tyres, the deafening crunch of metal against metal. The impact threw her forward, the seatbelt biting into her chest and shoulder as the airbags deployed with explosive force. Time seemed to slow, every sound muffled as though she were underwater. The world outside her window blurred, spinning in a kaleidoscope of lights and shadows before the car came to a violent stop. Nancy sat there for a moment, stunned and disoriented, her hands gripping the steering wheel tightly. Her chest heaved as she struggled to catch her breath, her ears ringing from the force of the collision. Pain radiated through her body, sharp and searing in some places, dull and throbbing in others. The scent of burnt rubber and the acrid tang of smoke filled the air. She tried to move to unbuckle her seatbelt, but her hands trembled too much to cooperate. A voice called out from somewhere nearby, "Mum, are you okay? Help is on the way." Nancy turned her head slowly, her vision swimming as she tried to focus on the figure outside her shattered window. A man, his face etched with concern, was leaning down, speaking to her. She nodded faintly, though she wasn't sure if she was responding to his words or simply reacting to the overwhelming chaos around her. The minutes that followed felt endless. Sirens wailed in the distance, growing louder with each passing second. A crowd had gathered, their hushed murmurs blending into a single, indistinct hum. When the paramedics arrived, Nancy finally let go of the steering wheel. Her fingers ached as they pried her loose from the crumpled remains of her car. She felt weightless as they lifted her onto the stretcher, her body disconnected from her mind. The last thing she saw before her vision blurred completely was the sky, now dark and speckled with stars. The accident changed everything. It happened suddenly. She was driving and then the car came out of nowhere. There was a traumatic brain injury that caused her to lose her vision partly. After a month, Nancy realized that she was completely blind. This was devastating because how could this happen to her of all people? More importantly, why her? It didn't seem fair that this happened, but Nancy had to adjust because she had no other choice. When her mother got sick, Helen just didn't sit around and feel pity for herself. Instead, she tried her best to go through with the medication, chemo, and everything else the doctors said. Her mother did end up dying, but it wasn't without putting up a good fight. Nancy needed to try to have that mindset. Yes, she was blind and had suffered through a terrible accident, but she needed to try to fight, doing her best not to pity herself. But it appeared that others didn't have the same feelings. Before the accident, Nancy had been the kind of person people admired. She was known for her sharp mind, her determination, and her ability to balance ambition with grace. People congratulated her on her successes and treated her with genuine respect. Even her father, though firmly rooted in his sexist beliefs, acknowledged her work ethic. "You're one of the hardest workers I've ever seen, Nancy," he'd once told her, his tone begrudging but sincere. It wasn't the heartfelt praise she longed for, but it was something. The accident changed everything. Suddenly, Nancy wasn't seen as smart or capable anymore. People who had once looked up to her now looked at her with pity. Their voices softened when they spoke to her, as though she were fragile. Their words, once filled with admiration, were now laced with cautious sympathy. "How are you feeling, Nancy?" someone would ask, their eyes darting away as if they couldn't bear to see her pain. "You're so strong to get through this," another would say, their tone patronizing in a way they probably didn't even realize. Even her father, who had always pushed her to work harder, seemed to change. His usual sharpness dulled into awkward restraint, as though he didn't know how to talk to her anymore. For Nancy, the shift was devastating. She could handle the physical challenges the accident had brought, though they were immense, but what she struggled with most was how the world now viewed her. The respect she had earned through years of hard work seemed to evaporate overnight, replaced by pity and an assumption of helplessness. For a time, bitterness crept in. She wasn't sure how to adjust to this new phase of her life, and the frustration was overwhelming. She had spent years building a reputation as a strong, independent woman, and now people treated her as though she were a burden. What stung most was the loss of her business. Nancy had poured her heart and soul into it, building it from nothing into something she was proud of. After the accident, she knew she couldn't run it anymore. Her vision impairment made it impossible. Her closest friend and trusted employee, Lily, stepped in to take over. "Nancy," Lily had said gently, sitting beside her one afternoon, "the business is going to be fine. I'll keep it running for as long as you need, and when you're ready to come back, it'll be here waiting for you." Nancy had nodded, her throat tight with emotion. Lily meant well, but the words didn't bring her comfort. How was she supposed to just come back? The doctors had been clear. There was little hope that her sight would ever return. Her world had permanently shifted, and she didn't know if she could find her place in it again. As days turned into weeks, Nancy realized she was at a crossroads. She could either let her anger consume her, turning her into a bitter and resentful person, or she could find a way to adapt. She thought of her father, whose rigid, self-centered views had shaped so much of her life. He had always clung to anger and control, and it had made him a hard, distant man. The thought of becoming like him filled her with dread. Instead, Nancy thought of her mother. Her mother, who had faced life's challenges with quiet strength and resilience. Her mother who had taught her to stand tall even in the face of adversity. What would Mom do? Nancy asked herself one evening, sitting alone in the dim light of her living room. She closed her eyes, imagining her mother's warm smile and gentle voice. She'd stay strong, Nancy whispered to herself. She'd keep going. But it wasn't easy. Nancy was adjusting to a whole new world. Lacking her sight was difficult, not that she wanted to sit and feel sorry for herself. Other people dealt with these disabilities all their lives and were fine. They adjusted, but Nancy felt like she wasn't going to be able to. All she could do was try to figure out how to navigate around the house. It wasn't easy. The house was big, and Nancy had to make sure she didn't trip and fall, injuring herself further. Eventually, Nancy did manage to navigate through the house successfully after a few tries, but it wasn't easy. People would ask for help in the beginning. However, eventually, they just gave up and let her do what she wanted. Another thing Nancy noticed about her disability was how it seemed to make her invisible. People acted as if she weren't there, speaking over her or around her as if her presence didn't matter. The first time it truly sank in, it left her shaken. It happened one quiet afternoon. Nancy was heading toward the living room, her cane tapping lightly against the polished floor as she navigated the house. Just before reaching the doorway, she froze. She could hear the sound of muffled giggling, Jessica's unmistakable laugh. Then a sound that made Nancy's stomach drop, the soft, unmistakable smack of a kiss. Her grip tightened on her cane. Her heart pounded as she stood there, her ears straining to make sense of what she was hearing. It couldn't be. She cleared her throat and called out, her voice firm but tinged with unease. "Is someone in here?" There was a long, almost uncomfortable pause. Then she heard Robert's voice, casual but slightly strained. "I was just in the study. Thought I heard something in here." "And I was sitting down in the living room," Jessica added, her tone light, almost too casual. Nancy's brow furrowed as she stepped cautiously into the room. The air felt thick, as though the walls themselves held secrets. "Oh," she said, forcing herself to sound nonchalant. "I thought I heard something." Neither of them said anything. The silence was deafening, filled only by the faint ticking of the grandfather clock in the hallway. Nancy turned her face toward where she thought Jessica was sitting. "You're sure there's nothing you want to tell me?" she asked, her voice steadier than she felt. Jessica let out a light laugh. "Nance, you're imagining things. Maybe you heard the TV or something." Robert chimed in quickly. "Yeah, nothing's going on. Are you feeling okay?" Nancy nodded slowly, though her mind was spinning. She wanted to believe them. She needed to believe them. But she couldn't shake the nagging feeling in her chest, the lingering echo of what she'd heard. Did I just hear my sister kissing my husband? The thought seemed absurd, almost ridiculous. Jessica and Robert couldn't do something like that. But the doubt lingered. What if? Over the next few days, Nancy did her best to push the warning signs aside. She told herself it was nothing, that her mind was playing tricks on her. After all, her disability had made her rely so heavily on her hearing. Maybe she'd misinterpreted the sounds. Maybe it was just an innocent moment, blown out of proportion by her own insecurities. Then Nancy started hearing more. At first, it was just whispers and faint laughter, Jessica and Robert giggling quietly when they thought she wasn't around. Nancy tried to ignore it, brushing off the sinking feeling in her chest. But the whispers persisted, growing more frequent and intimate, chipping away at her denial. Then one evening, as she carefully navigated her way upstairs, her worst fears were confirmed. From behind the door of her bedroom, the bedroom she shared with Robert, came the unmistakable sounds of intimacy. Her breath caught in her throat, her grip tightening on the cane as she stood frozen on the landing. Robert's voice drifted through the door, low and murmuring, followed by a soft laugh that made Nancy's heart drop. It was Jessica's laugh, the one she knew better than her own. Nancy staggered backward, pressing a hand against the wall to steady herself. Her mind reeled, rejecting the possibility even as the sounds continued. She couldn't believe it, wouldn't believe it, but there was no denying what she was hearing. My sister. My own sister. Tears welled up in her eyes as she backed away from the door, her body trembling. Slowly she made her way downstairs, every step heavier than the last. She sank into the couch in the living room, her hands shaking as she tried to process what she had just heard. It wasn't anger that overtook her at first, it was disbelief, followed swiftly by an overwhelming wave of pain. She wasn't devastated that Robert had cheated. Deep down, she had always known he was weak, a man who lacked the backbone or integrity to remain faithful. She had never loved him, not really, and she had long suspected he didn't love her either. But Jessica, the realization that her sister, someone she had grown up with, could betray her like this was shattering. Despite the distance that had grown between them, Nancy had never doubted her sister's loyalty. Now that trust lay in ruins. The betrayal wasn't just an infidelity, it was an attack on the foundation of her relationship with Jessica. How could Jessica, of all people, do something so cruel? How could she look Nancy in the eye, knowing what she had done? The tears came then, silently at first, spilling down her cheeks as she sat alone in the darkened living room. The house was quiet, the only sound the faint ticking of the clock on the mantel. Nancy buried her face in her hands, her shoulders shaking as the sobs came harder. It wasn't just the act itself that hurt. It was the deeper betrayal, the knowledge that Jessica had chosen to put her own desires above their bond as sisters. Her mind raced with memories, the childhood secrets they had shared, the times Jessica had comforted her after an argument with their father, the way Nancy had always felt protective of her younger sister. Had any of it mattered to Jessica? As the hours stretched on, the devastation began to give way to something else, anger. But it wasn't a fiery, explosive anger. It was cold and sharp, settling in her chest like a blade. But Nancy started to plan. She wasn't sure how she would expose them, but the thought consumed her. She couldn't let the betrayal go unanswered. One afternoon, as she wandered the house, trying to familiarize herself with her surroundings, Nancy stumbled upon something that would push her plan into motion. She found herself near the study, where Robert often worked and her father frequently held meetings. She moved carefully, her cane tapping against the edge of the furniture as she navigated the room. She reached out to steady herself but stumbled, knocking into the desk. Her hand brushed against a stack of papers, and instinctively she began feeling her way through them. Her fingertips grazed an envelope, thick with a distinct scent of expensive cologne she recognized as Robert's. Curious, she slipped it into her pocket, deciding to examine it later. At her father's house, similar moments unfolded. She would sit quietly in corners or wander the halls, unnoticed, listening and piecing together fragments of conversations. People seemed to forget she existed, as if her blindness rendered her invisible. She had become like a shadow lurking in the periphery, present but ignored. It hurt to acknowledge, but it was true. People often found it easier to turn their backs on her than to confront the discomfort of her disability. It was easier to pretend she wasn't there than to make the effort to include her. Nancy sighed, a soft sound of frustration and longing. If only Mom was still here, she thought. Helen would have known what to say, how to guide her through this tangled mess of betrayal and pain. Her mother had always been the steady voice of reason, the one who could find light even in the darkest times. But Helen wasn't here. Nancy was alone, almost. The one person who hadn't forgotten her was Benjamin. He hadn't quit after all. He stayed quietly steadfast, always ensuring she felt seen and cared for. It was Benjamin who brought her tea when she sat lost in thought, who guided her through unfamiliar spaces without making her feel helpless, and who spoke to her as if nothing had changed. When Nancy confided in him about her suspicions and her plan to expose Robert and Jessica, he listened without interruption. "I need your help," she said softly, her hands trembling slightly as she clutched her cane. "No one else will. I don't know how to do this alone." Benjamin smiled gently. "Miss Nancy, I've been with this family long enough to know its secrets. If you're ready to bring them to light, I'll stand by you. You don't deserve to go through this alone." Relief washed over her, and for the first time in weeks, Nancy felt a glimmer of hope. "Thank you, Benjamin," she whispered. I don't know what I'd do without you." Together they began to strategize. Nancy shared the fragments of information she had overheard, while Benjamin filled in gaps, recounting his own observations over the years. Slowly, a plan took shape. Nancy decided there was no better time to expose the truth than during the upcoming celebration of her and Robert's first wedding anniversary. The irony wasn't lost on her, using a celebration of their union to unveil its betrayal. It was a bitter choice, but it felt fitting. As the date approached, Nancy steeled herself for what was to come. She knew it would be painful, knew it would dredge up emotions she wasn't sure she could handle, but she also knew it was necessary. The party was in full swing, the clinking of glasses and the hum of conversation filling the air as guests mingled in the lavishly decorated living room. Nancy sat quietly at the edge of the room, her presence largely overlooked as usual. But tonight, that was about to change. When the moment felt right, when the chatter lulled just enough to capture everyone's attention, Nancy rose from her chair. She tapped her cane lightly on the floor, a subtle motion that silenced the room. "I have something to say," she began, her voice calm but firm. The murmurs faded as all eyes turned toward her. Jessica and Robert stood near the bar, their faces frozen in uneasy smiles. Nancy could almost feel their tension, but she pressed on. "I want to thank you all for coming tonight," she said, her tone steady. "It's a special evening, celebrating a year of marriage. But it's also a night for truth. And I think it's time everyone knows what's been going on in this house." A ripple of confusion swept through the crowd. Jessica's smile faltered, her hand tightening around her glass. Robert shifted uncomfortably, the colour draining from his face. Nancy's lips curved into a faint, bitter smile. "You see, for months, I've known that my husband, dear Robert, has been sleeping with someone else." Gasps erupted from the guests and a few exchanged nervous glances. Jessica visibly stiffened, her gaze darting toward Robert. "And that someone," Nancy continued, her voice cutting through the silence, "is my own sister, Jessica." The room fell completely silent. Nancy could feel the weight of their stares, the disbelief hanging in the air. Before anyone could speak, before anyone could remind her she was blind, Nancy raised a hand to stop them. "Yes, I'm blind," she said coolly, "but I'm not stupid. I might not see what happens in this house, but I hear everything. And in case anyone here thinks I'm mistaken, let me assure you, I have proof." Jessica's voice broke the silence first. "You're out of your mind," she said, her tone sharp and defensive. "Jessica, don't—" Robert started, but she cut him off. "No, Robert, this is ridiculous!" Jessica snapped, turning back to Nancy. "How could you possibly have proof when you can't even see?" Nancy tilted her head slightly, her expression calm. "Because I set up cameras when no one was home," she said evenly. "I have video evidence of the two of you together. And in case anyone doubts me, I'm happy to play it right here, right now." The colour drained completely from Jessica's face, her lips parting in shock. Robert's jaw tightened, his fists clenching at his sides. "Go ahead," Nancy said, her voice steady as a rock. "Deny it. Scream. Lash out at me all you want, but the truth is already out." "And scream they did!" Robert's voice boomed, accusing Nancy of being manipulative, vindictive, and unfit to be a wife. Jessica's words were sharper, filled with venom as she hurled insult after insult, trying to strip away Nancy's dignity. Through it all, Nancy stood silently, letting their fury burn itself out. When they finally stopped, panting and red-faced, their smugness creeping back as though they had won, Nancy simply smiled. "Are you finished?" she asked, her voice quiet but cutting. They exchanged a brief glance, looking smug and self-satisfied. "Good," Nancy continued, "because there's one more thing I'd like to share." The room tensed again as Nancy stood a little taller, gripping her cane firmly. "While you two were sneaking around thinking you had the upper hand, I was building something of my own. Something that has nothing to do with either of you or this family." Jessica frowned, and Robert's brow furrowed. For years, Nancy went on, I've been creating a business, a rival business to the one my father built. My empire, separate from all of you. It's mine, completely mine. A ripple of shock swept through the crowd, and murmurs began to rise. Robert's face twisted in confusion and anger. What are you talking about? He demanded. You've been… what? Running a business behind everyone's back? That's exactly what I've been doing, Nancy said calmly. While you've been lying to me, I've been building something real, something that's untouchable. And unlike you, Robert, I didn't need to cheat or betray anyone to make it happen. The room exploded with murmurs and whispers. Jessica's face burned red, her anger faltering as the weight of Nancy's words sank in. That's not all, Nancy said, her voice cutting through the chaos like a blade. The room, already buzzing with murmurs from her previous revelations, fell silent once more. I also know the truth, Father. Jack froze, his drink halfway to his lips. His eyes narrowed, scanning Nancy's face for any sign of what she might say next. At that moment, Benjamin, the butler, stepped forward, his posture straight and authoritative as he moved to stand behind Nancy. He clasped his hands behind his back, a silent yet unmistakable display of allegiance. Nancy took a steadying breath, gripping her cane tightly. I've learned that the so-called accident that killed my grandparents may not have been an accident at all. In fact, it looks like it was organized by you. The words hit the room like a thunderclap. Gasps rippled through the crowd, and all eyes turned to Jack. That's absurd, Jack snapped, his voice rising defensively. Where are you getting these ridiculous ideas? But Nancy wasn't finished. Her voice grew sharper, more resolute. You were the one who caused our mother's heart to break, all for money. You let greed consume you, and you destroyed the very people who trusted you. You disgust me, Father. The crowd erupted into murmurs, the tension in the room palpable. Nancy, Jack said, trying to control his tone, though his voice quivered with anger. You don't know what you're talking about. You've been misled, manipulated. By whom? Nancy asked, her voice cold. By the evidence I found? By the accounts of the people who worked for this family before they mysteriously disappeared? The truth is, Father, you've always been a bad man hiding behind wealth and power. Before Jack could respond, the sound of heavy footsteps filled the room. Several men in suits entered the house, their presence immediately commanding attention. Dad! Jessica cried, rushing toward Jack, panic written all over her face. Run! Don't let them take you! But Jack stood his ground, raising a hand to silence her. He turned toward the men, trying to compose himself, his voice steady but firm. Gentlemen, I don't know what this is about, but I assure you I've done nothing wrong. You must have the wrong person. The lead agent stepped forward, holding up a folder. We have enough evidence to start an investigation, Mr. Douglas. You'll need to come with us. Jack turned back to Nancy, his face twisted in disbelief and fury. How could you do this? He growled. I'm your father. Nancy's expression softened for a brief moment, her unseeing eyes fixed ahead. Yes, she said quietly, and it hurts me more than you'll ever know that I had to go to these lengths. But you've left me no choice. You've hurt this family, our mother, our grandparents, even Jessica and me. You need to pay for what you've done. Turning a blind eye to your crimes isn't helping anyone. Jessica sobbed, clinging to Robert, who stood silently beside her, his face pale. Nancy, how could you? She cried. This is our father. He's all we have left. Nancy tilted her head slightly, her voice calm but unyielding. If he truly cared about us, Jessica, he wouldn't have done what he did. Sometimes the people we love are the ones who hurt us most. That doesn't mean we protect them from the consequences of their actions. Jessica's sobs grew louder, but Nancy remained resolute. She had done what needed to be done. As the authorities escorted Jack out of the house, the weight of her actions settled heavily on Nancy's shoulders. A part of her felt a deep, aching sadness. This was her father, after all, the man who had raised her, the man she had once looked up to despite his flaws. But the larger part of her knew she had done the right thing. Jack Douglas was a man who had used his power and influence to destroy lives, all in the name of greed. He had hurt their mother, their grandparents, and countless others. Allowing him to continue unchecked would only make her complicit. "Benjamin," Nancy said softly as the room began to clear, "tell me honestly, did I do the right thing?" Benjamin stepped forward, placing a steady hand on her shoulder. "Miss Nancy," he said gently, "your mother would be proud of you. You've done something most people wouldn't have the courage to do. Sometimes doing the right thing means letting go of what we wish were true." Nancy nodded, swallowing the lump in her throat. She knew Benjamin was right. She didn't regret her decision, even if it left her heart heavy. As the last of the guests departed, Nancy sat in silence, letting the enormity of the night sink in. Her family's legacy was fractured, perhaps beyond repair, but for the first time in years, she felt a glimmer of hope. The truth was out, and now, finally, she could begin to rebuild, not on her father's lies, but on her own strength. A year after everything had settled, Nancy found herself stronger than she had been in a long time. Life had not been easy, but she had faced each challenge with resilience, slowly rebuilding herself and her world. One warm afternoon, she was sitting on her favourite bench in the park, the gentle breeze brushing against her face as she listened to the laughter of children and the rustle of leaves. It was peaceful, a moment of calm she had learned to cherish. Then someone sat next to her. "Nancy," a familiar voice whispered. Her heart skipped a beat. She turned toward the voice, a smile spreading across her face. "Mike," she said softly. It had been so long since she'd heard his voice, but it still had the same warmth, the same grounding presence she remembered. For a moment, neither of them spoke. Then the words began to flow. They talked for hours, catching up on everything and nothing, as if no time had passed at all. It was effortless, the kind of conversation that felt like coming home. In the weeks and months that followed, Nancy and Mike began to rebuild what they once had. Nancy found herself longing to tell him how she truly felt, but fear of rejection kept her quiet. Finally, one evening as they sat together in her living room, she mustered her courage. "Mike," she began, her voice trembling slightly, "I need to tell you something." He turned to her, his expression gentle and attentive. "What is it, Nancy?" She took a deep breath, her hands clasped tightly in her lap. "I love you. I've always loved you." For a moment, there was silence. Then Mike reached for her hand, holding it firmly in his. "I love you too," he said, his voice steady. "I never stopped." Tears filled her eyes, but this time they were tears of relief and joy. Things weren't instantly perfect. Nancy and Mike agreed to take things slow, both cautious about rushing into a relationship after everything they had been through. Mike's family, while kind, was hesitant at first. They worried about whether Nancy's return would bring more challenges than happiness. But over time, their worries faded. Nancy's honesty and determination won them over, and soon she felt like a part of their family. Mike's mother in particular grew close to her, reminding Nancy of her own late mother, Helen. Nancy found herself opening up to Mike's family in ways she hadn't expected, forming bonds that felt deep and genuine. The more time she spent with them, the more they became her family, filling a void she had carried for so long. About a year after they had rekindled their relationship, Mike proposed. The wedding was a small, intimate affair, nothing like the grand spectacle of her first marriage. It was simple, heartfelt, and everything Nancy had ever wanted. Not long after the wedding, Nancy discovered she was pregnant. The news brought her to tears, a mixture of joy and disbelief washing over her. She shared the news with Mike one quiet evening as they sat together on the porch, the setting sun casting golden hues across their yard. "Mike," she said, placing his hand on her stomach. "We're going to have a baby." His eyes widened in surprise, then softened as a wide grin spread across his face. "Are you serious?" She nodded, laughing through her tears. "Yes, we're going to be parents." He pulled her into his arms, holding her tightly. This is everything," he whispered. Nancy's life felt full in a way she had never thought possible. She had a loving husband, a child on the way, and a thriving business that she had built with her own hands. All of it was hers, achieved without compromising who she was. In those quiet moments, she often thought of her mother. Helen's lessons had guided her through the darkest times, teaching her the strength of standing up for herself and never settling for less than she deserved. "I miss you, Mom," Nancy would whisper to herself sometimes, a bittersweet ache in her chest. "But I know you'd be proud of me." Her thoughts of her mother were always accompanied by a quiet resolve. She would carry on Helen's legacy by being strong, loving, and fiercely protective of the family she now had. Jessica, on the other hand, was a different story. She remained as spoiled and self-absorbed as ever. A lost cause Nancy no longer had the energy to worry about. Jessica's actions had once hurt her deeply, but Nancy had moved past it. She had built a new family, one that loved her unconditionally and would never betray her. Nancy's hand rested on her growing belly as she sat on the porch one evening, Mike's arm around her shoulders. The stars twinkled above, and the air was filled with the sounds of crickets and rustling leaves. "This is everything I've ever wanted," she said softly, leaning against Mike. He kissed her temple and smiled. "And I'll spend the rest of my life making sure it stays that way." Nancy smiled, her heart full. She had faced loss, betrayal, and heartbreak, but she had found her way through it all. Now, she had a life worth fighting for, and she would never take it for granted.